to embrace the kaleidoscope that is our people, let us pause to understand that all our lives in these challenging times depend on the love, the courage, the honesty, and integrity of one another. Let us pause to be both humble and faithful as we endeavor to see each other fully and embrace the dignity that is commonly required for each of us to fully live our lives. Let us pause to be grateful for the diverse gifts of servant leadership that we are blessed to experience here at Hillel and across our nation. May those gifts in ourselves and in others help us in days to come to stand proudly together as a diverse Jewish nation, a bold Jewish nation that has outlived intolerance and hatred over 5,000 years. Help us to witness this as strength in each other and to support each other's capacity to speak truth to power, to stand when no one is standing, to dispel ignorance, to deny the need for division and strife, and to replace these barriers with a desire for truth, wisdom, compassion, sibling love, and sensitivity. May the shared roots between us and our ancestors renew us and keep us strong, so that we may see the day in our lifetimes when Am Yisrael will march together around the walls of exclusion, of racism, of anti-Semitism, of oppression, of exploitation, blowing the trumpets of truth, justice, equality, and faith until the walls come tumbling down. Amen. This is the truth and foundation through which I bring Jewish gospel into this room. You should know, Jewish gospel wasn't invented by Yavilah McCoy. You've got people like Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke, Yolanda Adams, and Joshua Nelson to thank. You also need to know that this music comes out of the journeys of the Spirit within my family, and that journey is a gift to all of us if we can come through a lens of diversity and inclusion to appreciate it. So without further ado, I'd like to teach you guys a Negro spiritual that came from my great-grandmother, a woman in the South, who first learned to sing gospel as she was learning to do the work of empowerment of her race, but what became a walk of the Spirit that helped her and our generations to join the Jewish people. So we're going to try this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sing one bar, and then I'm going to expect you to sing after me. Expect. You know what to do with expectations now. So I'm going to sing a bar, and then I'd like to sing after me. And this is dedicated to all people. When we say our God, we're talking about diverse entry points to God. So we're going to make sure we keep that covenant in mind. Praise the name. Your turn. Praise the name of our God. Praise the name. Praise the name of our God. Praise the name of our God. Praise the name. Praise the name. Praise the name. Praise the name of our God. Aren't you so singing? All right. We're going to try it one more time. Praise the name of our God. Praise the name of our God. Praise the name of
of Jewish pluralism. Yavilah McCoy and Yehuda Kurtzer are here with us this morning to remind us that pluralism is one of our core values in Hillel. And I believe that there is no better place in the Jewish world to explore the frontiers of Jewish pluralism than Hillel. Because what we all know is that on our college campuses, we have the widest distribution of Jews anywhere in the Jewish community. And through all those coffee dates and all those programs that we do, we are witnesses to what's happening in this new frontier, and we are challenged to serve that full spectrum of Jews on our campus. So this morning, as we talk about Jewishness, the new frontier of Jewish pluralism, I want to encourage us to think of ourselves as astronauts and as pioneers. Because here in Hillel, we have the courage to question our assumptions and to bring new insights to what we already know. And I want us to think about Moses in the wilderness as a shepherd, going to that place, Achar Hamidbar, that frontier at the edge of the place that was his place, because that's where he encountered God in the burning bush. We started this morning's program with song, and we're going to end it with song to claim that the pluralism work we do on campus across the spectrum is sacred work. If you felt your neshama wriggle, let's give it up again for Yavilah McCoy. Yavilah McCoy, who just led us in song, is the CEO of Vision and Company in Boston. I like to think of Yavilah as the needle on my moral compass. And she's the kind of person who'll come and stand right next to you as you're trying to figure out how to calibrate that compass on your phone, if you can imagine that, and she'll help you turn it all the way around until you can see what direction that moral compass is pointing in. She is the founder of Ayeka, one of the first Jewish organizations to provide Jewish diversity education and advocacy for Jews of color. She is an educator and activist, as we saw this morning, a spiritual teacher and a certified coach for the Auburn Theological Seminary Pastoral Coach Training Program. She's also the mother of 4 children, including a college-age daughter who's headed for Princeton in the fall. She will be leading a couple of sessions here at the Global Assembly on Wednesday, so be sure not to miss her. My name is Rabbi Julie Roth, and I'm the Executive Director of Princeton Hillel, and I'm proud to be in my 15th year in the Hillel field. Our main speaker, I'm really pleased to welcome to the stage Jody Bromberg, who's the CEO of Interfaith Family and one of our partnership sponsors today. She's going to share a few brief words about how Interfaith Family can help our work in Hillel. Jody Bromberg.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm so happy to be here. Such an incredible time. Thanks for the introduction, Julie. As she said, I am the CEO of Interfaith Family, and we are a national organization whose purpose is to support people in interfaith families in their exploration of Jewish life. And so there's no misunderstanding about what that is. It isn't. We're talking about families where one spouse is Jewish and another is another religion or no religion. And we embrace families and couples and students of interfaith families in all of their complexities, in all of their intersectionalities, and all of their diversities. And we do that by being really laser focused on our work, which includes a robust digital web presence, a website, and a staff and community of practice that doesn't exist in any other place around the country, in 8 cities focused on our efforts. But this assembly is about you. And so I want to be sure to tell all of you about how an interfaith family can help you either personally or with your work at Hillel. That staff, that community of practice that I mentioned, is made up of 8 rabbis, 8 project managers around the country, in addition to our national staff up in Boston. And so we think about interfaith families a lot. We think about their diversity, we think about how we can help them, we think about their intersectionalities. And so if you are thinking about how to ensure that your Hillel is a safe space, a comfortable space for students from interfaith families or in interfaith relationships, we can help. If you want professional development or training for your staff, we can help. If you want program ideas or resources that are accessible and easy to understand, and this is key, already made, we can help. And if you're in an interfaith relationship yourself or from an interfaith family and you want resources or to share your stories or simply support or people to talk about your life, about your journey, about your Jewish path, we're here and we can help. Sense a theme? So, come talk to us. I'm here with my colleagues, Interfaith Family COO Heather Martin, and Interfaith Family Bay Area Director Rabbi Michael Copeland, who many of you may know from her work at Stanford and UCLA Hillel's. And we are just so excited to be here and be a part of this global assembly. Over the next 36 hours, we'll have four chances around the clock to talk in a more meaningful way. The first is this afternoon from 4:30 to 5 at our sponsored break, our Cafe Hillel break. The second is tonight at the Community Partner Dessert Reception for late night owls like me from 9 to 10:30. The third is over breakfast tomorrow at 7:45. And then the fourth is our breakout session tomorrow afternoon at 4:45. So I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you and being a supportive organization in our partnership with Hillel, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
I'd now like to introduce Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer, the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Yehuda Kurtzer is one of the most important thought leaders of our time. I find for myself when I'm just hearing about a difficult topic in the news or really struggling with something in Israel or here in America, before I have a chance even to talk to somebody about what I might be thinking, a blog arrives from Yehuda Kurtzer with great insight into how to think about this. And he has so many gifts, but I think one of his gifts is the ability to go very deep into Jewish texts while still connecting them to a very, very broad perspective on the world. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer has a doctorate in Jewish studies from Harvard University and an MA in religion from Brown University. He is an alumnus of both the Wexner Graduate Fellowship Program and the Bronfman Youth Fellowship Program. As many of you know, Hillel has had a partnership with the Hartman Institute for nearly 4 years. More than 4 years. Some Hillel professionals, myself included, have taken part in an intensive Jewish learning experience through the Hartman Institute. And this experience has been about wrestling with the values behind our commitment to Israel and finding a new way to elevate and to complexify our conversations about Israel on campus. This experience continues to help me shape the way I think about Israel and Jewish identity, broadly speaking. Today, Yehuda is here to help us revisit our understanding of community, Jewish identity, and pluralism, ultimately with the goal of helping each of us at our own Hillels build even more thriving Jewish communities in all of their capacities. Yehuda Kurtzer.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Yavilah. I'm not going to sing. You know, Jewish pluralism in the Jewish community and across the Jewish people used to be essentially a conversation among insiders. We shared broad parameters of what it meant to belong and to be part of the Jewish people, and we had to debate how to transact within the context of shared parameters of who was part of the Jewish people around things that were transactions. How do we eat? How do we pray? How do we love? How do we talk? With whom do we talk? And how do we do that? And those are still issues that come to bear. I know a lot of your Hillels are still debating the conversations around Jewish pluralism among those Jewish students who everybody agrees is Jewish, who come committed to Hillel all the time, who participate in meaningful ways in Jewish life. But something pretty significant has transitioned in our community, which is that the very nature of what it means to be a part of the Jewish people has shifted powerfully, publicly, and in incredibly messy ways. As a result, The urgency of Jewish pluralism today is not simply about transacting with one another once we agree on the shared assumptions of who belongs, who's inside, and who's outside. But Jewish pluralism today is about navigating a messy conversation without any shared assumptions of what it means at a core level to be a Jew, a member of a Jewish community, or part of the Jewish people. This is manifesting in a whole variety of ways, and we'll try to talk about some of those today. So let me give you one kind of public and perhaps crude, messy example that signals the extent to which we are on uncharted terrain about belonging and membership in the Jewish people, and also a messy example that shows us quite how public this conversation is.
I'll tell you what's up. I'm a Jew.
Excuse me?
I'm a Jew. I finished converting 2 days ago.
Oh, wow. Welcome aboard.
Thanks. So I'll see you tomorrow?
Yeah, I have a cavity lower left. Hey, were you just at the health club?
Oh, yeah.
No, I must have just missed you.
Ah, well, I didn't do much. I just sat in a sauna. You know, it was more like a Jewish workout.
The guy's Jewish 2 days. He's already making Jewish jokes.
So what? When someone turns 21, they usually get drunk the first night.
Booze is not a religion.
Oh, that's my father.
That which reminds me, did you hear the one about the rabbi and the farmer's daughter? Huh? Those aren't matzo balls.
Do you think you should be making jokes like that?
Why not? I'm Jewish, remember?
I know, but...
Jerry, it's our sense of humor that sustained us as a people for 3,000 years.
5,000.
5,000, even better. Okay. Curtsy, give me a shtickle of fluoride.
We could probably actually just watch the rest of the episode. What's amazing about this moment, and I know that when you start explaining something funny, it goes from being less, it becomes less funny. First of all, this is just keep in mind, this is 20 years ago. Just pause on this for a second. You can use that as a moment to reflect on your life choices. What's amazing, though, is that already 20 years ago, there was an incredibly public, open conversation about the possibility of, as Tim Wally ultimately becomes disclosed as, converting just for the jokes. That is to say, cultural transaction, or the ability to cross a boundary to become part of a people with a totally different assumption than others might have about what the essence of Jewishness is all about. And in kind of open market environments in which the very essence of Jewishness, the points of crossover, the sense of belonging, means something much different than it ever did before. I want to explore 3 questions with you today. And it'll involve a number of your colleagues, some study together, and a group discussion. Number 1, what is the core commitment of Jewishness today? And if you're already frustrated by what I'm requiring you to do, which is to reduce the essence of your Jewish identities to a single core commitment, stay tuned, it's going to get worse. Second, what happens when different Jews answer this defining question about the core commitment of Jewishness today so dramatically differently? And third, what happens to these terms that we use so often, the Jewish community or the Jewish people, when each of the answers to this question about the core commitment, each of these attachments lives in isolation or in competition with the others? So as opposed to taking for granted that we have some notion of the Jewish people and the Jewish community, and therefore trying to talk about pluralism as a transaction within that framework of a community or a people, what happens to the very idea of community and people when the core commitment of what someone thinks it means to belong to a community or belong to a people is at odds with someone else's understanding of what those core commitments are? To flesh out this story, I've asked 5 of your colleagues in the room to tell their own Jewish story, which I'm going to then reductively categorize into single-line answers to these questions. And I'm acknowledging in doing so that I'm not trying to take complicated and messy Jewish stories and to reduce them just for the purpose of being rude. What I'm trying to do is to distill that these different answers to the question animate both Jewish historical understandings of what our tradition meant about Jewishness, and they animate incredibly different ideas about about what our communal priorities should be, how our communal politics should be transacted, and how we hold in relationship these core commitments as so different from one another. So first, one answer to the question of what is the core commitment of Jewishness today might read as follows. Jewishness is an identity based in the willingness to participate in the national story of the Jewish people. To tell a story, I want to call up Lior Sinzeiger. Say guys.
My Jewish identity is to Israel, both on a personal and professional level. My Jewish identity is connected to Israel, both on a personal and professional level. My connection started before I was born, with my parents making Aliyah independently, getting married in Israel, and eventually my brother and I, born and raised there. Having moved away from Israel and living in Canada for the past 25 years, the connection to Israel is still very much a strong part of who I am today. Hebrew is my first language, and to this day I still speak it with my parents. My wife and I send our kids to Hebrew immersion daycare and a Zionist day school. While having a core Jewish foundation and understanding is important, the connection with Israel is equally important for us. Ahavat Israel, this is what it comes down to, at a core value that is embedded in how we raise our family and how we carry ourselves. To some extent, the role that Israel plays in shaping who I am is difficult to express in words. When I go online every morning and do my usual routine, I check the weather, the sports, news, and of course, the Israeli news. It's just part of who I am. On a professional level, when I was looking for work, the criteria of the kind of organization I wanted to be a part of needed to include an element of Israel. I've been fortunate for the past 10 years that I've been involved with and in Israel education, helping young adults find their connection and passion with and to Israel. In the process, I've been able to take over 600 people on their birthright Israel journeys. There's nothing more gratifying than seeing people get that aha, their spark moment when they see Israel for the first time. And currently in my role at Hillel, I get to continue to help students feel that same connection to Israel and perhaps understand the value that Israel plays within their own Jewish journeys. Last week we celebrated Hanukkah, the story of the good versus evil, the light versus the dark. And my hope is that we should and need to spend more time illuminating the light of Israel instead of trying to minimize the darkness that we often get caught up in. Thank you.
Again, not to summarize, but at least to reduce a little bit to a core essence, Jewishness is an identity based in the willingness to participate in the national story of the Jewish people. And just to remind us, it's also possible that people will both identify with just the national component of identification with the Jewish people, or today it's possible to segment out and not identify with that particular story and see yourselves as in some ways part of the Jewish people. The two examples being a Druze soldier of the IDF who in some ways is identifying with the national story of the Jewish people, or on the reverse side, anti-Zionist Haredi Jews who want to separate out the national component of the belonging of the story of the Jewish people. So part of the reason I want to distill these into different essences is to demonstrate not just that they tell unique stories about what Jewishness means today, but that they're also separable in ways that may not have been true before in Jewish history. The second story, Jewishness is an indelible, unerasable identity based in ancestry or lineage or family. And to tell his story, Reuben Shimanoff.
Like the Uzbek rug hanging on the bathroom wall of my grandparents' apartment in Queens, my Jewish background is a colorful and complex tapestry. My Jewish journey began in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, in the homes of my parents and grandparents. Through life cycle rituals, holiday customs, traditional cuisine, language and music, my family connected me from an early age to the ancient Persian-speaking Jewish community that has lived in Central Asia for over 2 millennia, the Bukharian Jews. Though deeply rooted in the Near Eastern traditions of the region, this was a community that was simultaneously part of the Russian-speaking world. a community connected to other Russian-speaking Jews in the USSR through the infamous fifth line of the Soviet passport that stated our ethnicity as Yevrei, Jew. My Jewish journey continued when we immigrated to the US and settled in Seattle. Once there, I attended a Jewish day school in which I was introduced to Jewish religious customs and texts, knowledge that my family was deprived of for 3 generations. I'll always remember how emotional my grandfather was to witness me reading from the Torah on the day of my bar mitzvah. Neither he nor his son had been given that privilege in the Soviet Union. During my years attending the predominantly Ashkenazi modern Orthodox day school, I was also a congregant of a Sephardic synagogue that upheld the unique customs of the Ladino-speaking Jews from the Greek island of Rhodes. It is there where I learned almost everything I know about Jewish liturgy. Attending Shabbat services, I connected to the beautiful Mediterranean tunes of this unique community. Although these were formative years in my Jewish literacy and awareness, it was also the time that I was most removed from my own Bukharian Jewish background, in an attempt to fit in with American Jews around me. Only in college did I finally start exploring my heritage. I began asking myself, why wasn't the Jewish history and culture of my community ever mentioned in any of the classes in grade school, or the Jewish and Middle Eastern Studies courses I was taking at my university? So I started doing my own research, exploring my history and that of other relegated Mizrahi communities. And through this exploration, I connected deeper than ever before to my Mizrahi heritage. Now, living in the dynamic and vibrant city of New York, I have been able to amalgamate and embrace all the different components of my Jewish identity: American, Russian-speaking, Bukharian, Mizrahi, Sephardian. I have harnessed my own multi-layered identity to appreciate the myriad of communities that make up the Jewish cultural mosaic. I'm honored to bring that love for the diversity of the Jewish people to my work presently at Queens College, Hillel.
Thank you, Reuben. So Jewishness can be an identity rooted in ancestry, ethnicity, and so forth. What about when Jewishness is an identity rooted in loyalty to a set of beliefs or practices? Not necessarily about ethnicity or ancestry or even the actual story of the Jewish people, but a set of core ideological or practice commitments that we undertake that connect us to a covenant or to God or elsewhere. Carrie Shaw.
My story is not fully unique, but for a Hillel professional on the ground, it is. I'm a proud Jew who has built a wonderfully Jewish home with my Jewish spouse. But 5 years before I met him, and 6 before I started working at Hillel, I converted. I say God gave me the perfect parent. She just happened to be a Episcopalian. Thankfully, my mother always allowed my challenging questions and what would become a lack of faith as I finished high school. As time went on, I felt a lack of grounding in community as I had no faith home. I read books about faiths from east to west. If it was there, I read something about it all. Finally, in my early 20s, I decided to figure it out. I knew I believed in something bigger than just me out there. And as a Westerner, I felt very comfortable calling that thing God. That evolution and logic are real and valued things, that men and women are created equal, and that simply praying is never enough. Magic beans aren't real, even if Jack and his storybook tell us so. So I took a big step back from my Christian roots, and I focused on the big gal, or girl, boy girl, in the sky. I read a book, what I wish all my Christian friends knew about Judaism. The light bulbs started going on. I came from a home that held the same values that drew me to Judaism. I was raised to believe in the best in mankind, to have faith in a higher power, to treat others as I wanted to be treated, that love and kindness are worth just as much as became a member of the tribe. With the woman who gave me life standing just outside the water, I sank into the mikvah and became myself. It was an amazing moment. And here I am today. I struggle to remember the life I was before I was this person, before I became my whole self. It is something I rarely think about anymore. I love sharing my story of living in Israel for a year, finding the man who would become my husband there, an English Jew of Israeli birth. Who would have guessed? But honestly, the story of me finding my Jewish self will always be something I hold dear, even if it's not the first thing I think of anymore.
Jewishness can be an identity or a commitment that's rooted in loyalty to a set of beliefs or practices. And then there are all sorts of people who belong to Jewish communal life and in some respects belong to the Jewish people without Jewish parents, and people who have not necessarily converted, but who may understand Jewishness as an identity that's expressed through affiliating and belonging to a community. I want to call on Renee Moore.
Officially, my title is Manager of Operations and Events at Jewish University's campus. Unofficially, I am known as the mother of the office. Like a mom, I fix the bumps and bruises of not only the building but also the staff. I fret over the building and make sure things are just right and do the same with my peers. So when asked to speak on how it feels to be a non-Jew in the Jewish community at this incredible moment, I spent quite some time researching the meaning of not only community but also Jewish community. My major concern was deciding on my definition of community. Of course, being part of the community comes with a certain knowledge base. I was fortunate to have worked with several Jewish doctors prior to coming to the Freeman Center, so I was somewhat familiar with some customs and holidays. However, looking back on the last nearly 10 years, I realized how little I actually knew. Since then, I would like to say that I'm pretty knowledgeable in many things, from preparing Seder's for Passover, atoning for Yom Kippur, and to placating a fretting Jewish mom planning for a bat mitzvah. Looking at me, one would assume my community centers around the African American community. If you delve a bit further, you may say my community also includes PTA of my son's elementary school, or the parents of his soccer team, or the mom's group of his Boy Scout troop, or even my event planner group. Therefore, I say the major factors that make up my definition of community will be those with whom you have a connection, respect, and appreciation. Although I do not have a religious connection to Judaism, I do have a connection with people and culture. I am more comfortable with the community now than I was 10 years ago. Likewise, my respect for the people and appreciation for the culture have grown exponentially. I suppose this is why I've never stopped to concern myself with the idea of being non-Jewish in the Jewish community. After spending so much time in the community, I have come to feel welcome and a part of the peoplehood. So much so that I'm now called the Jewish mom of the office, and I wear that title with honor.
Thank you. And for our last category, to elevate things slightly higher than the cultural conversion of Tim Watley, Jewishness can be an identity rooted primarily in cultural participation. I'm going to ask Bev Szymanski-Addis.
Jew, a Judy, also known as a Jewish foodie. A Jew who eagerly awaits the annual Lachmathon on Hamantash and Bake with her 92-year-old hubby who's 80, an annual ritual that brings together 3 generations to cook, laugh, and celebrate, a tradition of recipes that far date my existence. What a gift it was to celebrate with them just a few days ago. I am the Jew who actively lives the Jewish calendar and finds comfort and meaning in the weekly rituals, prayer, and delicious Shabbos meal my mom prepares week after week and gathers us around the dining room table. I'm also the Jew that brunches on Saturday, extra cheese, full bacon. I am the quintessential Montreal Jew who grew up in a city where the deli and the bagel shop were and are historic landmarks whose rich stories of our past come alive on the pages of Mordechai Richler's novels. And although these institutions aren't kosher, I shept tremendous nachas as I walked by Schwartz's Hebrew delicatessen and salivated at the smell of a smoked meat sandwich, and yet have never indulged in these straight delicacies. You see, I'm a kosher Jew, a Jew who's kept my own version of kashrut for the past 30-something years. I am a meat-loving Jew who walks into a restaurant, bypasses the shrimp and steak, and makes a beeline for the veg burger. I'm a Jew that walks into a restaurant and knows that while my version of kashrut would never get a hechsher, when I order a meal, I'm constantly reminded that the way I eat is special and that I'm part of something much larger, the Jewish people. I'm also the Jew that fully respects my equally Jewish cheeseburger-eating husband and admires his unique connection with Judaism as he beams with pride wearing his huge Magenza bead necklace on his neck, just like Melech David's shield. And while we don't eat the same way, I'm deeply moved by his connection to the Jewish people as well. I'm the Jew that keeps a Jewish home, a kosher home, with 4.5 sets of dishes. Miltik and Fleischstick, Pesach, Miltik and Fleischstick, and a fork, spoon, and plate for his Chinese food. I'm the Jew that becomes fanatic on Pesach, scrubbing the counters, changing the dish soap, and searching for hechshers, making sure that every food item that we bring into our home is as kosher as any rabbi's home. Year after year, I ask myself, why do I do this? The stress, the time, the money, and yet I can't imagine not doing it. My Jewish identity is so deeply rooted in truth, and yet it's constantly evolving. I cling so tightly to my past, and yet I actively seek new ways to connect. From kishkas to quinoa, Noreen Gillids to Yodom Adolevi, we're an evolving people adapting to new times and new ways. Passover wouldn't have the same meaning for me if I didn't go through the pachka, as well as making my own twist on things. Much like our students, my husband and I have set an important, exciting juncture of our Jewish journey. God willing, in the next phase of our life, we will start a family in our first home. We will maintain the traditions that have shaped our past and develop new ones as we grow together. We are constantly asking big questions and wrestling with ideas and with each other. Sometimes I actually feel like a fiddler on a suburban 2015 roof. And while I can't tell you if our children will follow in the path of their kosher mama or their lobster-loving father, I can tell you that the values we derive from Judaism will fill our home like the smell of boiling chicken soup and hot challah from the oven.
Actually, I have friends who live in Savannah, Georgia, and they have 3 sets of dishes: milchik for dairy, fleischstick for meat, and seafood. Culture, civilization, and food oftentimes is actually a very defining framework for Jewishness and identity rooted in cultural participation. I can ask you to do something right now that's difficult and maybe a little bit obnoxious, but switch over from Twitter to the messaging on your phone, and I'd like you to do as follows. I'd like you to text the number of the Jewish articulation of the core commitment to Jewishness, right? Each of these has a number, to the number 22333. That's who you're texting to, and this is your choice: national, ancestry, culture, belief, and community. Now I know, first of all, just because I'm generous, you get 2 votes. So if you can pick your top 2. I know, what's that? 2 different texts. You can do 2 different texts and pick 2. Now I know that in the process of doing this, some of you are saying, but I identify with all of them. That's okay. I still want to challenge you to try to probe a little bit which of these actually speaks closest to your understanding of what is the core essence of your Jewishness. Both because I think for some of you it's probably true. One of these probably does speak louder than others. But also because there are significant consequences, even if we pretend that all 5 of these are equal and compatible, there are significant consequences to the fact that Jewish communal policy, Jewish community behavior, institutional behavior, and tensions in Jewish life are oftentimes created because implicitly, under the surface, some of these as priorities or core commitments are valued over others. So even if you want to claim that all of them are actually important, it doesn't mean necessarily that our community always behaves as though all of these are equally important and as though all of them are completely compatible. Has everybody voted yet? Now you're still working on it? I'll give you 30 more seconds to figure out who you are. identity based in the willingness to participate in the national story of the Jewish people. Ancestry. Jewishness is an indelible identity rooted in ancestry. Cultural. Jewishness is an identity rooted in cultural participation. Beliefs and practices. Jewishness is an identity rooted in loyalty to a set of beliefs and practices. Or community. Jewishness is an identity expressed through affiliating and belonging to a community. Okay, 1 second. Okay. So we'll try to keep this poll live if we can after this presentation, and we'll try to share the data. We've got 500 responses from the room. That could be actually 250. We got 500 responses in total. Good job, everybody, on the texting. So let's just make a couple of observations here. It's interesting that belonging and affiliating with the community is the far and away winner above cultural, folk ways, beliefs, and practices, and that actually the lowest number of people identify with belonging to the national story of the people, or, it's pretty much dead heat, ancestry and birth. This is interesting for a lot of reasons, one of which is that many of our core texts would assume the otherwise, right? That ancestry, who you're born to, what your genes are, what your ethnicity is actually considered to oftentimes be something very important. And certainly the national story of the Jewish people, as it gets characterized in Jewish politics today, is oftentimes thought of as the most significant Jewish commitment that we have. Hold on to this for a second. Meditate on it. So I want to do today, okay, we're going back to the, one way to understand this is to put this in a little bit of historical context and to remember that actually all of these categories have been pre-modern categories as well. Religious identity, ethnic identity, national identity, cultural identity, or communal identity, these ideas have been around for a long time, and we Jews are not creating or inventing these categories or understandings of what it means to be Jewish today. They've always been there. However, we as a community oftentimes were held together coercively by external forces, whether it was anti-Semitism and ghettoization as the kind of political and ideological tools in which we were connected, and the lack of political autonomy, or even some narrative that we may have held ourselves about our status as a separate or chosen people. Those are kind of the negative or positive versions of the story, all wound up creating the possibility that we retain some sort of group identity, even though all of these forces or these ideas about a core commitment of Judaism existed at the same time. And this goes back to what I said at the outset, that pluralism, once you have a clear black line that surrounds your community from other people, involves navigating and negotiating within the context of a shared framework and trying to figure out how to make it work. But the fact that you have a shared framework that keeps you all together means that pluralism is a kind of tactical tool of relationship and not necessarily a threshold crossing process of figuring out how do these core commitments intersect or sometimes contradict with each other. So I want to ask 3 questions, and then I'm going to ask you to talk to each other for a little bit. Pluralism used to, well, 2 really. Pluralism used to take for granted we were all Jews, but focused on how we get along with different commitments. What happens when we differ on the core premise of how we define Jewishness? And what happens, more importantly, when each of these can stand alone without requiring the other? The fact that each of you made a choice, or at least 500, somewhere between 250 and 500 of you made a choice to say, this stands out to me as more important than the others, means that you're making a certain expression, you have a certain intuitive understanding that something stands out more than the other, and it may not require the other. Maybe I can be A without having to care about B. And that means that our pluralism, our urgency, requires something very different than we have some sort of shared assumption. For 4 of these categories, and the handout that's in front of you, there are 1 or 2 texts. Each of these texts tells a story about boundary crossing, either someone becoming a Jew or someone trying to lead the Jewish people. And in each of these categories, you'll see that classical texts from the Bible to the rabbinic period to the present have also taken for granted that there can be totally different ideas, totally different assumptions about what the core commitment of becoming a Jew is about. Or if somebody tries to leave and we say, no, you can never leave, right? We are the great Hotel California of religions. If that's the case, then we're also taking for granted that we think Jewishness means a certain type of identity that cannot be erased, and therefore it may not be about affiliating or belonging to a community, but something indelible or unerasable. What I'd like you to do for the next 15 minutes is to study in chevruta. I'd like to turn this banquet hall into a Beit Midrash, a study hall. I want you to do a couple of things. First of all, maybe it's the person next to you or two people next to you. I want you to read these texts out loud to each other. You don't have to read all of them. If you want to gravitate towards the categories that you chose or the categories that you struggle with the most, feel free to do that. What I want you to do is also think about your own choices and your own identities. The purpose here is not to now sideline yourselves and read classical texts as though your own personal experience doesn't matter in this journey and now you're looking only to the canon. I want you to use your own biases and your own instincts as the means through which you navigate these texts. And so if you come across a text that you don't understand, read it again. And if you still don't understand it, either move on or talk about what you're thinking. The point of these texts is not to be an obstacle, but to a vehicle for your own conversation. When we come back together, which we will in 15 minutes, I'll offer some concluding thoughts and we'll wrap up with another musical piece. Okay? Get to it. feeling as an educator or a person to tell people to stop learning. So I encourage you to take these with you, to keep studying them, I don't know, read them to your children, inscribe them on your doorposts. I hope what you were able to capture out of these texts is the actually very significant difference between, for instance, when Maimonides says that the key to converting somebody or accepting someone for conversion is their willingness to throw their lot in with the Jewish people despite how bad it is sometimes to be a Jew. And he's expressing a core idea about Jewishness, which is about national belonging. And how dramatically different that is than, for instance, the Midrash, which says, had it not been for the Jewish people accepting God's law and God's covenant, they would be equal to God as all the nations of the world, which tells a story that Jewishness is about commitment to beliefs and practices. And that even though there are ways in which we can probably integrate between all of these ideas, there are different emphases being placed throughout our tradition which correlate to different emphases that we feel as individuals and as leaders about which of these commitments of Jewishness is more important. And that it's actually incredibly difficult to hold all of them together as part of a complex identity. And it's even more so incredibly difficult for us as leaders of a broad community to imagine that they are held together without problematics, without differences in emphases here and there. I want to conclude with a couple of observations. First of all, if the first picture that I put up before imagined that we were all essentially in one circle held together by forces against our will, what would it look like for us to start imagining ourselves not as a circle, but as a complex Venn diagram? That each of these circles of community and commitment actually have their own integrity. There's a cultural or ethnic or religious Judaism that doesn't necessarily involve the individuals who identify with it requiring or assuming that they fit into all of the other circles. This would have to be an animated, constantly moving Venn diagram, because for some people it might be, well, I see myself as nationally and communally connected to the people, but I don't really like Jewish food. Or perhaps I may be a Jew by birth, but I don't see myself as connected to Jewish community in any sort of meaningful way. And that for some of us, we may see ourselves as the hot core, right? Those who are actually feel that they're connected to, you can interpret that however you like, connected to all five of these circles, that it doesn't tell an accurate story necessarily about all of the people who see themselves as committed or one way or another to all aspects of Jewish life. I want to leave us with three ideas which I want to talk about as the educational agenda for new Jewish pluralism. Three big ideas. If we could work on this, people, we could do something. The first is convergence. What would it look like for us to see part of our educational work as trying to converge towards the center of the Venn diagram without taking for granted that Jewishness involves starting at the center of the Venn diagram? So maybe part of our challenge as educators to say to people, look, you have a serious identity that's on this part of the Venn diagram, but what can I do to help you coax towards the middle? Because more is better. Right? 5 points of entry, 5 core commitments betrays that this is a complex, multivalent tradition, and there's what for you to gain out of understanding that this tradition is not merely about culture, beliefs, practices, ethnicity, but also about the national story of the Jewish people. So the first goal is convergence. The second is thickness. How do we also take seriously that each of these spheres matters and is serious and reflects somebody's story and reflects community stories? And that without just doing the work of convergence, which means trying to force these stories together, how do we take seriously what it would mean to thicken each of these core commitments of Judaism on their own? That somebody says, I'm a cultural Jew, I want to say to them, let's work harder to make you the best cultural Jew you can be. If you're a religious Jew, I want that to be a thick and robust identity that doesn't require my saying to them, oh yeah, you may be a religious Jew, but are you also a communal Jew? What would it look like for us to do the work of convergence simultaneously to the work of thickness? And the third is that we need some new language, some new terminology. The challenge I want to put in front of us is, are we comfortable, for instance, with the idea that long term there may be a difference between the terms Jew, member of the Jewish community, and That there might be somebody who fits into one, but not 2 and 3, and so forth. Historically, we haven't been particularly comfortable with that, and therefore we've elided between these terms as though we know exactly what we're talking about when we mean each of them. But if we're actually living in a world of a Venn diagram, there may be individuals and people who we can say comfortably, that person is part of the Jewish people, but I don't necessarily identify them as a Jew by legal standards. And as difficult as that is, as hard as it is to sustain this kind of multiple terminology for a community that's out there, it may be our only technique to hold ourselves together. In other words, these are not efforts to actually promote a culture of difference in the Jewish community, as much to acknowledge the existing difference that's already there, and to revise our approach, our terminology, our language, and our philosophy of education to acknowledge those differences and to work around them. Ultimately, the educational agenda of New Jewish Pluralism is going to have to be rooted in a comprehensive and radical empathy for all of the transformative change that's taking place all around us. A deep acknowledgement that this is who the Jewish people are becoming, mostly because of forces that are good, but almost entirely because of forces that are out of our control. And together with that pluralism of a radical empathy for others, the willingness to include people in our broad, evolving circles and Venn diagrams, together with that, we have to challenge ourselves to think totally differently about the new Jewish realities that are coming, not with fear, but with deep self-confidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yehuda. And also to all of our colleagues who shared their personal and beautiful and moving stories with us. If you'd like to do some more in-depth learning with Yehuda, he will be leading a session after lunch. Before we conclude, I also want us to give a special thanks to Abby Dauber-Stern. Abby, to stand up in case you don't recognize her. Abby is the Vice President of Global Jewish Experience for bringing Torah and thought leadership back into the center of Hillel. We will close now with a final song led by Yavilah McCoy. When the song is finished, please exit this room and go to Ballroom A for lunch.
Selection of Jewish gospel is one of the more recent additions in our family. My mother and I were actually taking a walk on Saturday, going to synagogue together. This is like maybe 3 years ago, and we had a horrible winter. Even last year in Boston was pretty bad. There was a lot of snow, and when spring came, the trees were just very heavy. They looked almost pregnant with their energy wanting to expand. And as we were walking and looking at all the trees that were overhanging as we headed our way to the synagogue, I started to ask my mother about this Aretha Franklin song about Call the Tree. Turns out it was originally written by Paul Robeson. And we started a conversation about what is it about our Torah that makes it like a tree? I mean, look at all these beautiful trees. What makes it like a tree? And my mother and I started to discuss this idea that even after heavy storms, the tree is flexible enough that it can hold it. We started talking about a tree that always has its face looking at the sun. We talked about a tree being able to hold heavy bodies of water without breaking. Essentially, we talked about a tree being open. And eventually we started to come to the realization that for us as African American Jews, journeying in this way through our spiritual choice, that the Torah has held us. It's held us. It's held our energy. It's held our enthusiasm. It's held our hope. And so this is a song that we made up walking to shul. And I'm going to teach it to you. And it goes like this. I think that I shall never see intimately lives with rain. Poems are made by simple fools like me. But only God can make a tree. I want you all to stand up. I want you to think about the work of diversity and inclusion as an opportunity for you to be open like a tree. So try that on for a second. Open up. Yes? Look at all those beautiful trees. Turn around and look at all our beautiful trees. All right, back up here. Back up here. All right. Now we're going to do this in Hebrew. Eitz Chaim hi l'machazik v'tom le'av me'usha dirach echad archei noam v'chol netivotecha shalom hashivenu elecha Adonai v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu Kirketem.